Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are all at your home and you're safe. And to begin this session, first of all, I would like to thank all our COVID-19 Corona warriors, the doctors, the nurses, the paramedics, the ambulance drivers, the police personnel, and the essential services delivery people. Now, why did I choose to talk about how to resolve a conflict today? The primary reason is that conflicts are an inevitable part of human life. Whether you want it or not, whether you like it or not, you are going to face conflict. And therefore, before I even talk about resolving conflicts, allow me to talk about what conflict really is. Conflict is defined as differences in and among individuals. Now, differences among individuals are easy to understand. I may have difference with person A may have difference with person B may have a difference with C may have a difference with me, so on and so forth. Now, these are differences among individuals. But what are differences in individuals? Those are very different kind of differences. I may have a difference between my head and my heart, which means my head might tell me to do one thing while my heart might ask me to do another. I may have a difference between my judgment and my desire. Also, I may have a difference to choose between multiple alternatives. The Hamlet question: to be or not to be, to go or not to go, to do or not to do. And therefore, the moral of the story is that the first level of conflict that you need to resolve is the intrapersonal conflict. And that is the conflict within your head, the conflict which is within you. Only after you have resolved this conflict should you move over to resolving the next level of conflict, and that is the interpersonal conflict. So, after the intrapersonal conflict comes the interpersonal conflict. And interpersonal conflict is the conflict between people, conflict among people. Once you have resolved this, you'll also realize that once in a while, sometimes, be it your professional life or be it your personal life, you are a part of the group. And the group is a collective with whom you identify. And therefore, the first level of conflict that you resolve as a part of a group is the intra-group conflict, the conflict within the group. Because remember one thing, if you have not resolved the intra-group conflict, you will never be as strong. Remember Ramayana? The conflict that Ravan had with Vibhishan, and that eventually led to his downfall. Remember Mahabharata, Drona, Krip, Bhishma, all three of them were conflicted with Duryodhan, and then finally Yuyutsu was the last straw who moved over to the Pandav side, and that led to the downfall of the Kauravas. And therefore, first you should resolve the intra-group conflict. Once you are done with that, then you can resolve the final level of conflict, which is the intergroup conflict. And that intergroup conflict could be conflict between families, conflict between countries, it could be anything. Having said that, please remember one thing: not all conflicts are bad. There are some conflicts which can actually be functional. So, conflicts essentially can be centered around three things. Conflicts can be centered around resources. For example, let's say you are founding a startup with two of your friends, and now you are trying to figure out as to how much share of equity would each one of you have. This is a conflict which is centered around resources. And research says that low to medium level of conflict centered around resources is actually a functional conflict. Next is a conflict which is centered around processes. So let's say an institution of higher education. An institution of higher education is mandated to increase its financial revenues, to strengthen its financial resources. And there are multiple ways of doing that. So somebody says in the leadership that, hey, why don't we increase the fees? Another person says, let's not increase the fees, let's expand the portfolio of the programs. And another one says, well, let's not do either. Why don't we actually invest the surplus that we have in some different financial instruments? Now, this is a conflict which is centered around processes. And once again, research says that low to medium level of conflict, which is centered around processes, can actually be functional because it can lead to certain innovative ideas and innovative results. However, the third level of conflict, which is a conflict centered around people, research says that any conflict any amount of conflict which is centered around people is going to be a dysfunctional conflict. And what are these conflicts? So, for example, let's say I was the one who suggested that let's expand the portfolio of the programs. And another colleague suggested that no, let's invest in slightly different financial instruments. And I say, hey, you have no idea about finance. Or I say, you are a fool. Now, this is a conflict which is centered around people because instead of focusing on the issue, I have focused on the person. And the consequence of this conflict will always be dysfunctional. So, this is so far as our understanding of conflict is concerned. And as we did last Saturday, I'm going to speak for another 4 5 minutes about how to resolve a conflict. And then I'm going to take the questions. I can already see a lot of messages in there. Now, how do you resolve a conflict? Please remember that the first step to resolve a conflict is to acknowledge that the conflict exists. More often than not, we cannot resolve a conflict because we simply choose to ignore its existence. We think that there is no conflict. Please remember, what you think really does not matter. If the other person perceives that there is a conflict, then there indeed is a conflict. And you should acknowledge that the conflict exists if the other person also perceives it. Once you have acknowledged the conflict, the second and equally important step is to acknowledge your role in the conflict. Please remember, you will always have a role to play. It's not ever the other person's fault all the time. There would be some fault that you need to attribute to yourself. And therefore, you must acknowledge that you have also had a role to play in this particular conflict. Having acknowledged that, that is when you go on to try and resolve the conflict. And this is where I introduce to you the dual concerns model, which is derived from the game theory. And it says, ask yourself two questions. How important are the substantive issues of the conflict to you? So, for example, when you're sharing the equity, when you're talking about sharing the equity, how important is that equity sharing to you? Whether you get 40% or whether you get 45% or whether you get 35%, how important is this thing to you? The second question you need to ask yourself is, how important is the relationship with the other person to you? The relationship with the person that you are in conflict with. If the answer to both the questions is yes, that both of them are very important, then the best way to resolve that conflict is to collaborate, which means get into a problem solving mode, sit with this person, and then try to resolve it together by having open ended conversations. If at all, the substantive issues are important to you, but you do not need to or do not wish to keep a relationship with the other party, in that case, the best way to resolve the conflict is to get into the competitive mode. Squeeze as much as you can out of this conflict. Try everything that you can to win simply because the relationship is not important to you. On the other hand, if at all the need for the relationship or the desire for the relationship with the other person or the party is more important to you than the substantive issues of the conflict, in that case, the best way to resolve the conflict is to accommodate, give in. Give in because you are looking at some larger interest or some larger gain which you will get out of that relationship. And if neither is important, neither are the substantive issues of the conflict important, nor is the issue of relationship important, which means it's a trivial issue with somebody who you don't care much about, in that case, avoid. Just don't get into that conflict. That is a conflict which is best left all by itself. So please remember, there is no single way to resolve a conflict. The resolution of the conflict will depend on the answer to these two questions. How important are the substantive issues to you? And how important is the relationship with the other party to you? So I'll stop here now and I'm going to take the questions which I can see coming over here. So shoot your questions. Thank you so much for all of those nice things that you're writing in there. Interpersonal and intrapersonal conflict, I have already explained it to you. The difference between the two, as I said, intrapersonal conflict is the conflict within your head. When you are conflicted within, which could mean that either there's a conflict between your judgment and your desire, between your head and your heart, between what you really want to do versus between what you are being made to do in a professional life, for example. Or it could be a choice between multiple alternatives. For example, when I was preparing for this, I was wondering, should I wear this maroon jacket or should I wear the blue jacket? Now, that itself is a situation of conflict. Please remember that conflict, as I said, is an inevitable part. It doesn't have to be really a fully blown out conflict between two nations, but we are conflicted at each and every point of time in our lives. Okay, key factors to eliminate these conflicts. Now, Arjun, we can't eliminate conflicts because, as I said, conflicts are differences in and among individuals. And please remember, therefore, considering that we all have our individuality, we are always going to have our own perspectives, our own opinions, and thereby we will be different from others. And so long as these differences exist, and these differences are actually beautiful, because as I said, there are some conflicts which are actually functional. Because we have differences which are centered around resources, tasks, processes, etc., innovations happen, creativity comes in. And therefore, don't try to eliminate the conflicts, try to resolve them. And the resolution of the conflict, as I said, will depend on certain factors, the dual concerns model, but most importantly, the resolution of the conflict depends on the fact that are you acknowledging that the conflict exists? Number one. Number two, are you acknowledging that you also have a role to play and therefore you are taking certain responsibility upon yourself? And the third, are you making the conflict personal? Never allow the conflict to become personal. Try to keep the interest and the focus on the issue of the conflict rather than the other person. Well, thank you for all of those nice points. I'm trying to sift through and look at some of the questions. ADR, alternative dispute resolution, is it a better method than litigation? Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, the Industrial Disputes Act 1947 even talks about arbitration as one of the methods. But please remember that in India, at least so far as the industrial relations is concerned, we have voluntary arbitration, which means that if the conciliation proceedings fail, in that case, the two parties have the opportunity to, have the option to go to an arbitrator. However, more often than not in India, arbitration hasn't worked. So if I remember correctly, the last positive and a very good case of arbitration was when Gandhiji had actually arbitrated between the textile union and the owners. And that was, of course, way, way back. And the reason why arbitration hasn't really worked in India, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms haven't worked in India, is because one, it is voluntary in nature, and therefore it is very difficult for two parties to find somebody who they can trust. And second, there is an easy access to litigation. There is an easy access to actually go to a court. And that is the reason why ADR hasn't picked up. But I think ADR is now picking up because we also have a national promotion board for arbitration, which has been set up. And some of the negotiators like me also volunteer to arbitrate between conflicting parties. And I've been fortunate enough to get this opportunity both with organizations as well as individuals to arbitrate. So if any of you have a need where you want somebody, a third party arbitrator or a mediator, do let me know. Shantanu, is conflict good for group cohesion many a time? Absolutely. How does a group come together? It comes together because of multiple reasons, but the most important reason of a group coming together is their belief in the vision, which means a belief in the target, a belief in the direction that they are moving, in the belief on what they have set out to achieve. And if your belief is in that particular vision of yours, you have a joint dream, you have a common dream, in that case, you will accept and acknowledge whatever it does and whatever it takes to actually reach to that dream. And therefore, if conflicting ideas within the group, as I said, which are centered around the resources in the process, can actually lead to better ideas, the group will become cohesive. See, a group actually thrives on complementarity. The last time when I was talking about in a particular webinar, I spoke about the need of diversity. Why do we need diversity in a management institution such as ours? Because the ideas that come out of a diverse group of people are likely to be far more inclusive. Likewise, the ideas that come out of a diverse group, even in the workspace, are likely to be far more creative and are likely to be far more innovative than the idea which come from people who think the same way. And therefore, I think it's a great thing for group cohesion. What about the new normal? Is Dheeraj's question. Now, this is a question that we all have been debating with as to what this new normal is going to be. Now, people have started talking about two complete extremes. So, the debate currently is hinging on two completely different extremes. One side of the debate is that there is nothing like a new normal. Why? Because human memory is short. And the moment we come out of the pandemic, within 4 or 5 months is going to be business as usual because we really don't care. And that's what history has shown us. On the other hand, people are saying that this pandemic is so pervasive that there has to be a new normal. There will be a change in the way people think and behave because earlier pandemics were actually localized. They didn't spread across the world. They did spread across many, many countries, but not at this scale and not with so much of uncertainty surrounding it. I think the answer lies somewhere in the middle. So I don't think that the world is going to completely change and suddenly we are going to become extremely wary and suspicious of each other. Globalization will stop. Countries will shut their borders, so on and so forth, and seal themselves in. No, that's not going to happen simply because it cannot happen. Human beings are explorers by nature. We are an exploratory species. We will travel. We will go out. Number one. Number two, the ideal form of collaboration in any particular species is to do whatever we are best at. And therefore, countries will continue to do what they are best at and trade it with the other countries who will probably do what they are best at. What is going to change are some of our factors, such as hygiene factors, the way we take care of our personal hygiene, the way we meet each other, the way we greet each other, and hopefully, I have my fingers crossed, the way we look at our relationship with the universe around us. Because one of the things that I see people in this particular lockdown period is I won't say they're getting spiritual, but they are certainly reflecting and they're certainly introspecting. And I think there is a renewed understanding that the world is interconnected. We cannot insulate ourselves from what's happening around the world. And the moment this realization sets in, you need to then try and figure out who are you really in the context of this entire universe? Who does your universe comprise of? And what is your relationship with this particular universe? So I think, Dheeraj, there is going to be an increased understanding, first of all, of one's own self, second, as to who does my universe comprise, and third, about what is my relationship with this universe, and by extension, what is my obligation towards this universe, which I call my own. How to resolve conflict with self. Now, conflict with self can be resolved, Arjun, through reflection and introspection. You know, the conflict happens because our mind is the seat of desire, and this mind travels a lot. Yad jagrato dur mudaiti daivam tadu suptasya tathaivaiti duram gamam jyotisham jyotirekam tanme manah shiv sankalpamastu. This mind of ours travels so much when we are sleeping as it does while we are awake. And therefore, the key to actually train this mind is to control this mind. And since you cannot control the mind directly, you have to control what drives the mind. And what drives the mind is your breath, the shwas. And pranayam is the way for you to still your mind. I'm not saying that pranayam will suddenly make you start thinking in superlative terms, or give you enlightenment, but pranayam helps you in controlling your breath. By virtue of controlling your breath, you can actually still your mind. And once you still your mind, then the answers to your questions start coming in you when you get into the introspective and the reflective mode. Now, Priyanka is asking me how long will it take to get back on track. Now, I'm not too sure get back on which track, Priyanka, but uh, if your question was regarding COVID, what nobody knows because different models have made different predictions. The latest model which has come has made predictions about the peak in India reaching in July and thereafter the curve flattening. The other models which had predicted the peak as well as the flattening of the curve happening much earlier. And this is only India. And as I said, that we are not insulated from each other. We are also connected to the rest of the world. And some of the models are actually predicting the peak flattening or the curve flattening somewhere in December. Suffice to say, I do not see, given all of these models, and I can be completely wrong, and I would be happy if I am wrong, if I'm proved to be wrong, but I do not think that any international travel is going to happen this year, except for perhaps essential travel. So far as domestic travel is concerned, I think our government is looking at the issue very, very seriously, and the domestic travel may start as early as next month. But again, I'm afraid that that will be only essential travel. Kadamni, how long should you allow the other person to dominate? Now, these are two different things. So when I said that if the relationship is much more important to you than the substantive issue in a conflict, in that case you should be accommodative. But being accommodative does not mean that you let a person run all over you, step all over you, and treat you like a doormat. Remember one thing, it is not worth it to keep a relationship, however close that relationship be in terms of the societal norms, etc. It's not worth it to keep a relationship that actually damages your self worth. If you are surrounded by toxic people, if you are surrounded by people who are harming your self esteem, and particularly if you're a woman, why? Because it's more difficult for a woman. You get into that vicious cycle that somebody harms your self esteem, and then you start thinking low of yourself. And once you start thinking low of yourself, you start underperforming. And once you start underperforming, the other person once again thinks lower of yourself, lower about you. And that leads to a vicious cycle. So, my suggestion, you may find it a little controversial, is don't allow anybody to use you as a doormat. If at all the person is dominant in terms of being a little more assertive than you are, it's great. But if the other person is being toxic, then my suggestion is that relationship is not worth it. Family feud, Sudhir, it's I will give the same answer. In family, when I talk about a relationship, I'm not talking about a blood relationship. I'm talking about a relationship which you have chosen. Blood relationships are not chosen. However, you may choose to walk out even of a blood relationship. So my suggestion, as I gave it to Kadamini, was that what you have to look at is where is your self worth? Is it getting damaged in this entire process? If it is, then the relationship is not worth it. If it is not, and it is merely a question of the other person trying to be more assertive or the other person trying to win brownie points, then remember, in humility lies the answer. I don't mind if the other person is winning so long as it is better for both of us. But if it is going to violate my self esteem, if it is going to hurt my sense of self worth, then it is not good. Because no matter how strong we are, no matter how courageous we are, no matter how equanimous we are, if a person keeps pulling us down over and over again, and if we live in negativity all the time, at some point of time, it's going to weigh us down. And that to me is not worth actually taking. Opinion. That's a very good question that many a times people think perspective and opinion are one and the same thing. No, not at all. Everyone has an opinion, even about things that they have absolutely no clue about, simply because they have probably read something about it in the media, or they have read something about it on the social media, or they have heard about it from something. Please remember, perspectives are different from opinions. Perspectives are opinions which have been substantiated with either facts that have been brought to you or that you have accumulated, or some research that you have done, or some massive reflection that you have done on that particular issue and then drawn a conclusion based on your judgment and based on your sense of discretion. And therefore, never ever equate perspectives with opinions. Don't go by opinions. Don't go by what other people think of you as well. Because this is another of the question that sometimes other people may think something about you and that starts weighing you down. Please remember what others think about you is none of your business. They have a right to think whatever they wish to. What you think about you is what really matters. And so long as you think that you are on the right path, that you have the capabilities, don't let other people's thought processes or evaluation of you weigh you down. Unless, as I said, these people are the ones who are very, very close to you. You meet them day in and day out. You can't escape them. And they are the ones who are bringing in toxicity into your life. In that case, at some point of time, you have to break up. Daily practices to identify the intrapersonal conflicts. Geeta, I'm not too sure if there are some daily practices, but what has actually helped me, because I don't like getting into the normative mode, so all of us have different ways of evaluating ourselves. The mode that I personally follow is that before sleeping, I normally get to the bed with a book and I sleep while reading most of the times. But that's also the time when sometimes I just reflect on the day gone by and I think about what I did, why did I do what I did, and if there is something I could have done better. And then the first thing in the morning is when I try and introspect. Even when I'm doing my yoga, I try and reflect on what I'm going to do and whatever has happened to me in the past. I think if you can be mindful, if you can find any time of the day, again, as I've been telling to people, yoga works for me, but I'm not going to be prescriptive here and say that that is what you should be doing. I would love it, of course, if you do it, but whatever works for you, find a place, but make sure that you speak to yourself every day. Make sure that you introspect and reflect every day. Don't keep it for the end of your work life saying that okay, when I turn 60, that is when I'm going to introspect and look at how I should have lived my life. Not at all. I mean, what are you going to do with all of that reflection and introspection at that point of time, because you do not even have time to do the course correction? Remember one thing: you have to be a better person tomorrow as compared to today. And to do so, and to be able to be so, you need to reflect and introspect every day. Do whatever works for you. I'll take one more question because it's already time. I know the time flies. You people have been so amazing. What if decision making authority is biased and we are not getting an opportunity? There's a whole study of upward influence tactics. So, one is that you can try rational persuasion with this person. And if the rational persuasion does not work, you can try a coalition, which means collect some like minded people and then try to influence this person. Say that, look, all of us think that this is a good idea. So maybe you should listen to this idea. And if this none of these two work, I mean, neither of the two works, neither does rational persuasion work, nor does the coalition work, then go for the upward appeal, which means talk to the boss's boss. If you are sure about your conviction, I'm sure that person is going to listen. But make sure that that is the third option that you take and not the first or the second option. So thank you very much for being with me here. In all probabilities, I'm going to see you next Saturday at 3 p.m. You were such a lovely audience or viewers, and I can see that there's so many questions that I've not answered. What I'll do is I'm going to collate all of these questions, and with these questions perhaps I'll also form the topics of my next FP Live. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Stay home and stay safe.